Elijah Cross was 37 years old the morning he came home from a 14-month federal contract in Anchorage, Alaska, and found another man's boots on his front porch. They were expensive boots, the kind of boots a man buys when he wants people to notice the price before they notice the man. They sat beside the welcome mat Elijah's late mother had given him the month he closed on the house. A mat with a simple woven pattern she had chosen because, she said, it looked like something worth coming home to. Elijah stood on the front walk for a moment and looked at the boots. Then he looked at his house. The lights were on in the kitchen and in the upstairs bedroom that had always been his bedroom, and there was a truck in the driveway he had never seen before. His wife, Camille, had not answered his last 3 calls. It had driven directly from the airport. He had his duffel on his shoulder and 14 months of documented precision-level work behind him, and a cashier's check for $218,000 in his jacket pocket, his net earnings from the federal contract, the last installment of a quiet plan that had been in motion longer than Camille had any idea. The garage, which sat detached at the back of the property behind a padlock only Elijah held the key to, had not been opened once in his absence. He knew this because of the sensor. Camille did not know about the sensor. She also did not know what was in the garage. Nobody did except one man in Cincinnati and one woman in Philadelphia, both of whom were waiting on a call from Elijah before the week was through. What the man in the expensive boots was about to discover would unravel every calculation Camille had spent 11 months building. What Elijah had stored, documented, and protected in that padlocked garage was not tools, not furniture, not the ordinary residue of a working life. It was the shape of a future she had already tried to claim for someone else. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from. And subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The house was in a quiet section of Cincinnati, Ohio. A wide lot neighborhood of older 2 stories and mature trees where the blocks had names and the neighbors knew each other by sight if not by conversation. Elijah had bought it 6 years ago off a foreclosure listing, paying under market for a place with good bones and significant cosmetic neglect. The kitchen needed a full gut. The hardwood floors under the carpet were scarred but salvageable. The detached garage had a concrete slab that had been poured with real precision. He had gotten under it and checked the way a man checks a foundation before he commits to a structure. It was a master electrician with a journeyman's card, a federal clearance level most people in his trade never reached, and a reputation among the Cincinnati trades for finishing work that other electricians came to look at the way carpenters come to look at a piece of joinery made by someone who understood wood down to the grain. He had spent 12 years wiring installations that ordinary electricians were not permitted to enter: defense facilities, federal data centers, secure government infrastructure in 4 states and 2 territories. He understood systems. He understood how power moved invisibly through walls, and how a building that looked dark from the outside could be fully lit inside if you knew where the feeds ran. He had learned over those 12 years that most people moved through the built world in a state of comfortable ignorance about what held it up, what kept the lights on, what had been placed precisely and deliberately inside the walls they never thought to open. He had never minded being invisible infrastructure, but he had always documented the work. He had rewired the house himself in the year after he bought it, working evenings and weekends, every circuit mapped in a binder that lived on the shelf above his workbench in the garage. His mother, Diane, who had driven up from Memphis to see the house the first summer he owned it, had stood in the kitchen and looked at the new recessed lighting he had installed and said, "Baby, you made it look like it was always supposed to be this way." She had died 18 months later, a fast illness that allowed only enough time for Elijah to get there and hold her hand at the end. He had come back to Cincinnati and finished the bathroom tile by himself over a long weekend because he needed to work with his hands and he needed to be in the house she had seen. Camille had come into his life about a year after that. She was a purchasing manager at a regional healthcare company, smart and well-organized, with a manner that Elijah had initially read as focus and later came to understand was performance. They met at a gathering at a mutual friend's house in Norwood. She had asked him about his work with the kind of genuine curiosity that had seemed at the time like real interest. They dated for 10 months. They married in a small ceremony at a botanical garden downtown. For the first 2 years, the marriage was good. Not extraordinary, but solid. The way a correctly wired circuit is solid. current flows. Nothing trips. Something had shifted around the third year. He noticed it the way he noticed problems in a system, not as a single dramatic failure, but as a pattern of small anomalies that didn't match the blueprint. She began working late on Thursdays in a way that became routine enough to stop mentioning. Her phone, which she had once left freely on tables and countertops, migrated to her pocket and her nightstand. She stopped asking about his contracts with the particular interest she had once shown. A weekend trip to Columbus with a coworker she described briefly and did not mention again. A new gym she joined in a neighborhood she did not live near. A dinner conversation where she talked about the house in the way people talk about things they are beginning to think of differently, appraisingly, at a slight remove, as though measuring it against an alternative they had not yet disclosed. He noted these things. He did not confront them. It was methodical by training and by temperament, and he knew that confronting a system before you understood it produced bad data. The federal contract in Anchorage had come through his clearance channel. 14 months, substantial compensation, the kind of work that appeared on no public job board and could not be explained to a spouse without clearance-level authorization. He had briefed Camille on the basics, signed what needed signing, and left on a Tuesday morning in September with his duffel and his tools. He had also, before he left, installed one additional sensor in the garage. A small, battery-powered contact sensor on the interior side of the padlock door, linked to an encrypted notification on his secondary phone. If the door was opened, he would know. If power to the sensor was cut, he would also know. In 14 months, the sensor had never fired. In that same period, he had received 4 calls from Camille and had placed 11 that went unanswered. He had spent the quiet hours of those 14 months in Anchorage, finishing something he had started 2 years before he left. His hands did not shake when he stood on the front walk and looked at the unfamiliar boots. He set down his duffel. He walked around the side of the house to the garage, fit his key to the padlock, and went inside alone. He did not go inside the house first. The garage came first. It always came first. The decision the betrayal required of him had already been made. What remained was the walkthrough. In the spring, nearly a year before the Anchorage contract, Elijah had been on a short regional job in Cleveland when he ran into a man named Gerald Reeves at a diner near the worksite. Gerald was a retired paralegal from Philadelphia who had moved to Ohio for his daughter's family and who, at 71, had the organized, patient manner of a man who had spent 40 years preparing other people's legal arguments and had his own well-indexed library of conclusions about how things came apart. They had talked over coffee about the work, about Cincinnati, about Elijah's house. At some point, Gerald had said, "You know what men in your profession always underestimate? The documentation. The work they did on their own property, on their own time, with their own hands. No one tracks it. And then when a dispute comes, it's invisible." Elijah had looked at him for a moment. "What kind of dispute?" he had said. Gerald had shrugged. "Any kind," he said. "You'd be surprised." Elijah had driven home from Cleveland and spent a Saturday in the garage pulling out every receipt, every photograph, every materials invoice from the 6 years he had owned the house. He had a contractor friend named Raymond who had helped him on the kitchen. Raymond had kept his own records. He called Raymond that afternoon. Then he called his accountant. Then he called a woman in Philadelphia named Claudette Reeves, who turned out to be Gerald's daughter, and who was, as it happened, a licensed family law attorney with a secondary specialty in marital property disputes. "Tell me about your house," Claudette had said on that first call. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send me everything." He had spent the next 4 months building the documentation package that now lived, organized, indexed, printed, and photographed, in a fireproof box bolted to the concrete slab of the padlocked garage. Purchase records, the original foreclosure deed, every materials receipt from the kitchen gut, the hardwood floor restoration, the bathroom tile, the new wiring, the garage conversion, the landscaping, the detached studio space he had framed and finished in the back corner of the garage that, per Claudette's guidance, he had formally appraised at completion. That appraisal valued the completed studio alone at $34,000. When he left for Anchorage, the documentation was complete. Claudette held a copy in Philadelphia. A second copy lived in a safety deposit box at a credit union on Reading Road that Camille had never visited. He had been a systems man his whole life. A system that wasn't documented wasn't a system. It was a hope. 3 months into the Anchorage contract, a message came through a mutual friend, a woman named Tanya, who worked with Camille and who had been watching the situation with the quiet distress of someone who knew too much and had finally decided the weight of it outweighed the loyalty. Tanya said only, "There is someone in the house. Has been for about 2 months. His name is Preston Ware. He works in insurance. She says she is going to file." Elijah read the message once. He forwarded it to Claudette. He went back to work. Claudette had sent him a response within the hour. "Good. That accelerates our timeline. By the time you land, we'll be ready." By the time you land. He had held on to that sentence for 11 months like a man holds a level while the concrete cures beneath it. The calm performance, those last 11 months of unanswered calls and short-forwarded messages and the deliberate act of not announcing an arrival date had cost him something he acknowledged only once. Alone, on a Tuesday night in Anchorage, with the work done and the radio quiet. There were years in that house. The kitchen he had gutted and rebuilt, the floors, the wiring behind every wall. The studio he had framed for no practical reason except that he believed a man needed a room in his own house that was entirely and privately his. It had built a place that deserved better than what it had been made to hold. The loss of the marriage was real. He did not pretend it wasn't. He just refused to let the loss be compounded by inaction. It went back to the schematics on his desk. He finished the contract. He came home. Real Power operated in quiet rooms and in padlocked garages, in fireproof boxes on bolted concrete, in the gap between what a person thought they understood and what a man had actually built. Preston Ware was, by the available evidence, a man who liked to be seen. Tanya's message had included a name and a general description, and what Claudette's investigator turned up in the weeks before Elijah landed was a picture of a man who drove a leased BMW, maintained an Instagram account with 2,400 followers that documented vacations and restaurant meals, and had a credit profile notable primarily for its aspirational gap, the distance between the life he presented and the one the numbers described. 2 judgments in the last 4 years, a garnishment that had been released only 6 months prior. A lese on the BMW that was, per the investigator's note, 47 days delinquent. He had moved into Elijah's house, into the bedroom Elijah had rewired himself, onto the hardwood floors Elijah had refinished by hand, and had, by Tanya's account, begun referring to it in social settings as Camille's place. Claudette had pulled the property records as a matter of course. The deed was in Elijah's name alone. The mortgage, originated before the marriage, was in Elijah's name alone. Ohio law on separate property was well established. What Camille had apparently told Preston about the likely outcome of a divorce filing was, Claudette noted in her summary, either a significant misrepresentation or a significant misunderstanding. Either way, it was not Elijah's problem to correct. Not yet. The day before Elijah flew home, Claudette had the filing ready. She was waiting on one instruction. He sent it from the Anchorage airport. Go ahead. He had landed in Cincinnati at 2 in the afternoon. He had driven from the airport in a rental car. His own truck was registered to a separate address, a small piece of deliberate planning from 2 years prior. He had not told Camille his arrival date. He had told no one except Claudette and Raymond, who was parked 3 blocks away at that moment, waiting on a text. He stood on the front walk, looked at the expensive boots, and walked to the garage. He stayed in the garage for 9 minutes. He opened the fireproof box, confirmed the contents were intact, and pulled out a single envelope he had placed there before he left for Alaska. Inside was a photograph of his mother at the kitchen island, taken the summer she visited. The new recessed lights, catching her face at an angle that made her look the way she always looked when she was proud of something she would never say out loud. He held it for a moment. Then he put it in his breast pocket. He texted Raymond. Come around. He texted Claudette. On the property. Then he walked in the front door of his own house. Camille was in the kitchen when he walked in. She turned from the counter with a coffee mug in her hand, and her expression moved through 3 stages in about 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, and a control reset into something she was trying to make look like composure. You didn't say you were coming back today, she said. I didn't need to, he said. It's my house. From the top of the stairs came footsteps. Preston Ware came down in socked feet. The expensive boots were still on the porch, and he was a tall man, broadly built, with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years using his physical presence as its own argument. He looked at Elijah with an expression that was working hard to be casual and not quite getting there. Elijah looked at him once, then he looked at Camille. She had the look of someone who had rehearsed a version of this moment that was going differently than the one actually occurring. Ryman is going to be at the front door in about 4 minutes, Elijah said. He's going to help me with some things from the garage. I'd appreciate it if you gave us room to work. Camille started to speak. Elisha turned to the kitchen counter, set down his duffel, and began making coffee with the focused, unhurried attention of a man on familiar ground. He ran his hand along the edge of the butcher block island as he moved. A reflex, checking for level, the body remembering what it built. Preston sighed. I think we should talk about this like adults. Elijah turned and looked at him. He did not raise his voice. It did not change his expression. Anger required ongoing investment in someone's capacity to surprise you. And Elijah had not been surprised. You're wearing socks on my floors, he said. The ones I refinished myself. I need you to go upstairs and get whatever belongs to you and come back down. It was not a threat. It was a measurement. The kind of sentence that arrives already load-tested. The doorbell rang. Raymond came in with 2 other men Elijah had worked with for years. They went to the garage. They began moving the contents of the fireproof box to Raymond's truck. Claudette arrived 45 minutes later in a car Elijah did not recognize, with a folder under her arm and the deliberate, unhurried walk of someone who had made this kind of entrance before. She introduced herself to Camille by name and firm. She set the folder on the kitchen island, the island Elijah had installed himself, imported butcher block, bolted to a frame he had built over a long weekend in the 3rd year of ownership. Inside the folder were 41 pages, the full documentation of Elijah's sole ownership, the appraisal of the completed studio, an accounting of every capital improvement made to the property in 6 years, with receipts and photographs, a separate section documenting the mortgage, the original purchase, and a comparable market analysis showing the current property value at $387,000 against an original purchase price of $194,000, an increase of $193,000, substantially all of which was attributable to improvements Elijah had made with his own labor and his own money before the marriage began. And at the back of the folder, filed 2 days prior in Hamilton County, the divorce petition, with a motion for immediate exclusive occupancy of the marital residence pending resolution. Camille looked at the folder. She looked at Claudette. She looked at Elijah. Preston Ware had come back downstairs with a bag and stood at the edge of the kitchen. He looked at the open folder on the island. He looked at the receipts. He looked at the appraisal. He looked at the number $387,000 beside the name Elisha J. Cross and the phrase sole-titled owner. And the expression that had been working hard to be casual stopped working entirely. I think I'll wait outside, he said. He picked up his boots from the porch on the way to his leased BMW. Camille said quietly, I didn't know you'd done all of this. Elijah looked at her. He thought about his mother at the kitchen island, about the recessed lights, about the weight of a photograph in a breast pocket. I know, he said. That's the thing about working in the dark. Most people don't know where the power actually runs. Egg gathered his copy of the folder, buttoned his jacket, and walked out the back door toward the garage. Ed did not look back. 8 months later, Elijah Cross stood in the finished studio at the back of the garage, which had been converted in the months since the settlement into the workspace he had always intended it to be. The hardwood floors extended into it now. He had matched the grain and stain himself, a Saturday project in May that had taken most of the afternoon and some of the evening. The new workbench ran the full length of the east wall. The wiring was exactly as he had specified, every circuit mapped in a new binder on the shelf. The settlement had been resolved in 22 days. Ohio's treatment of separate property, combined with the premarital improvements documentation Claudette had assembled, had produced an outcome that left the house and its equity substantially intact. Camille had received her share of the marital liquid assets, which was fair, and Elijah had accepted it without contesting. because taking what was fair from someone who had tried to take what wasn't was not a principle he was willing to bend. Preston Ware had returned the BMW to the dealership 6 weeks after the day he picked up his boots from the porch. The garnishment had apparently resumed. Elisha had not looked into this himself. Raymond had mentioned it in passing over lunch, and Elisha had registered it the way you register a weather report for a city you no longer live in. Camille had relocated to an apartment in Blue Ash. He had heard she was well. He hoped it was true, the way you hope something without weight. The woman who sat in the camp chair near the studio's east window most Saturday mornings was named Diana Webb. She was a structural restoration specialist who worked with a preservation firm in Cincinnati, and she had come to the property 3 months after the settlement to assess the original brick on the garage exterior for a historic tax credit application Elijah had filed. She had spent an hour on the exterior and then asked if she could see the interior, and spent another 40 minutes looking at the slab and the framing and the electrical work with the focused appreciation of someone who understood what they were looking at. She sighed. Whoever wired this knew exactly what they were doing. He told her that was him. She said, "I know. It shows." They had coffee. They talked for 3 hours. She asked good questions and did not perform for him. And he found that after 14 months in Alaska and 8 months of careful legal work and one long Saturday of matching hardwood grain, there was nothing he wanted more than a person who was simply and thoroughly present. Imani, Elijah's younger sister, who had driven up from Memphis twice during the proceedings, and who had held the original copy of the Anchorage contract earnings check in her hands and whistled low and slow when she understood the full picture, had met Diana in July and called Elijah afterward to say, "She corrected your electrical diagram on the wall, and you just smiled. That's how I know." It had laughed. It was the first time he had laughed easily in a while. The morning light came through the east window and caught the grain of the new workbench and the maple floor he had matched himself. Outside, the oak in the side yard was turning its leaves going copper at the edges, the way they always did in October. His mother had never seen the studio, but she had seen the house when it was just beginning. The recessed lights, the freshly tiled floor, the windows he had replaced, one by one. And she had said it looked like something worth coming home to. He thought she would have liked this room. It was done building for people who couldn't see what he was building. He had built everything worth keeping, and now he was building forward, and the foundation was sound. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.